All right, well, here we go. We are jumping into healing generational trauma. My name is Cavalin Day. I'm here on behalf of the Well Counseling and Consulting Group in collaboration with Redeemer Presbyterian Church. And I'm so excited that you're spending a little time with me over your lunch hour. We are so proud of our partnership that we have had with Redeemer Presbyterian Church. They created the 4-8 Fund in 2020. And unlike lots of people who said, in 2020 and 2021, hey, we want to be a part of change. We want to help address some of these disparities. We want to provide resources. Not only did they do that then and continue to do that now, but they've even doubled down. They've gone out and secured additional funding and additional resources to provide mental health treatment for people of color. So we are so proud of this partnership. We joined them this summer and started this series, and this is the final installation of that series of parenting workshops. And so this is a topic that really can affect anyone, but as parents, you have a really unique ability to have a powerful impact. So we are so happy that this is something that we are able to bring to you. Our goals for today are to explore this concept of generational trauma. It may be something that you're familiar with just kind of in general, but maybe you haven't had an in-depth conversation about it. So we're going to talk about it a little bit differently because we want to look at how it impacts family dynamics, but also you as an individual, your children, your siblings, and extended family members. We're going to talk about some of the ways that it can show up in your family, but most importantly, we're going to talk about how to address it and how to heal some of the wounds through some very practical techniques. We'll talk about those here. And I'll give you some examples that you'll be able to use and how you can not only heal, but make sure that we're not passing along these challenging things that can show up in our lives. I always like to give a disclaimer whenever I'm doing anything that is talking about mental health. I always want to give just kind of a basic disclaimer, which is this is information that is intended for psychoeducational purposes. I specifically created this so that it has a very user-friendly approach, whether you have a background in mental health or you've ever received mental health treatment. I want you to feel comfortable with this information. We're going to talk about strategies and techniques that you can use, but this is not intended to be medical advice. I am not your coach. I am not your therapist. I always encourage you, if as we're going through this conversation, you think like, I think there's something I need to do with this. I think there's something here that I need to work on. I will encourage you to reach out and get the guidance of a qualified healthcare professional. I will have some referral options for you at the end of this video as well. But I just want to make sure that you know that this is just for you to have some knowledge and some information, and there may be some next steps necessary for you as well. Because we're talking about trauma, I will bring up certain things that might be disturbing for you, that might feel a little bit uncomfortable to you. I want you to do your very best to take care of yourself. I'm not going to have anybody's camera on just so that we all have a little bit of a little bit more privacy. So feel free to kind of step away, back away if necessary. We're going to be talking about things that can be traumatic, and sometimes you're not prepared for a little something to be activated in you, and that can happen from time to time. So feel free to take care of yourself as you see fit. If you're not familiar with me, my name is Cavalin. I'm a person who wears lots of hats, but under our workshop for today, I am the Director of Operations here at the Well Counseling and Consulting Group. I am a coach and a consultant. I work with schools and youth serving organizations and our corporate partners as well. I'm also a mom. I'm also a daughter. I'm also a sister. I am a certified trauma-informed coach because I really believe that as we are seeking to make our best life and put our best foot forward in our life, we have to acknowledge all of the things that have happened to us and might have an influence on that. And I bring all of that to this conversation specifically for parents who are saying like, I'm trying to do better. I'm trying to make a better way for my kids, but there's some things that I think might be holding me back. So I hope you will get some really good information today. When we experience traumatic things, it's important to understand that this impact can last for generations. A lot of times we think about just that immediate thing that happens, that immediate challenge or situation, but it really can reverberate for years and years and years. It's not something that just happens and then we just kind of get over it, quote unquote. It can be something that has a lasting impact. When I use the term generational trauma, I want to kind of break down a couple things. So first and foremost, when I say trauma, I mean a deeply distressing experience that can have a traumatic impact on you. This could be something that occurs one time, like a car accident, or it could be something that occurs multiple times in periodic ways. So when we think about things like poverty, or we think about chronic, maybe sexual abuse or things of that nature, it each time it happens, it's still traumatic, right? So this could be something that happens one time, or it could be something that happens repeatedly. You may also hear people talk about the term ACE, okay? And that term is adverse childhood experiences. Adverse childhood experiences is a term, kind of a phrase that we use based upon a study that was conducted by Drs. Validi and Anda not really that long ago, about 20-ish years ago, maybe it's probably been 30 years now. So they conducted this study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and they identified a slew of experiences that when these things happen to children, it can create a negative impact on the quality of their lives, but it also can shorten their lifespan, right? And we look at the top 10 of those when we do the ACE questionnaire, which can sometimes be given at your doctor's office or different different places where this screening might occur. But when we look at that, what they're really actually looking at is these traumatic experiences that can happen in your childhood, okay? But when we're talking about generational trauma, right, that is the trauma that isn't processed in just one generation, but it continues to impact that, future generations, future families. It can show up in the behaviors that we have. It can show up in the things that we believe. It can show up in the way that we parent, right? There's a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome that I often recommend, particularly to parents who say like, hey, I want to parent differently. I want to recognize the ways in which my behavior might not be producing the results I want to have. Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome is a book that I recommend a lot for that. But when we're looking at things like war, slavery, abuse, systemic discrimination, those things are all considered sources of generational trauma. And I want you to understand something, that this actually can show up in your DNA. So while we don't necessarily have a trauma gene, the way that genes are expressed through epigenetics can be impacted by trauma. One of the things that I kind of give as an example is when we think about the sickle cell trait, okay? Because people who were from Africa or who are descendants of Africa, they oftentimes had to fight malaria. They had the sickle cell trait that was, hey, our body decided we don't want to keep dying from malaria. So we got this trait which helps you be more resistant to malaria, right? It's something that kind of evolved over time. As multiple family members who had the trait came together, there could be the sickle cell disease, where people who both carried that trait was expressed in their children. That is technically an example of how generational trauma, being exposure to malaria, can create a change in your DNA, right? And we see that in a medical way, but it also can show up in just like general behavior. So the way a mom or a parent interacts with their child, okay? And so when I say trauma, what do I mean? I have right top of the line a pandemic, because we all who have lived through the pandemic of 2019 through 2021, right? When we think of that, we have all collectively experienced a traumatic event. Now, each of us has a different response to that. So for some of us, it's more of a traumatic response because maybe we were more negatively impacted. Other people may not have had that experience, and maybe it wasn't as negative for them, but we have all collectively gone through something that is traumatic. Other things might be sudden or violent death, sexual assault, or physical assault, accidents, poverty, childhood abuse, or neglect, right? So somebody who was maybe emotionally not available or physically not available. Things like racism and microaggressions, sexism, um, all of those types of things, bullying, workplace aggression, if you're being manipulated or mistreated at work, that can be experienced as a trauma in your body. Having a chronic disease or illness, that could be impacted as trauma in your body. Fertility issues, whether it be domestic abuse or financial abuse, any of those kind of abuses that exist in relationships, right? Those things can be traumatic. There's also things like vicarious or secondary trauma. So if you are a doctor, a nurse, a social worker, and you're constantly being exposed to other people's trauma, that can be experienced as a trauma for you. And this one, a lot of people don't really think of, but spiritual abuse or manipulation. So when we look at like cults or people who have utilized spirituality to try and control other people, that can be traumatic as well. So all of these, right? All of these things can be experienced as trauma. When we talk about them from a generational standpoint, we generally are thinking about things that happen to collective groups of people, right? So groups of women or groups of Black people, okay? This can show up in subtle ways, even if we think we are fine. One of the common things that I have heard, I've coached parents for years. One of the common things that I've heard is, I got spanked and I turned out fine, right? And that may or may not be the case. You may be living a perfectly fine life, right? But maybe you would have had something that was better. Maybe you could have had a different experience, is one thing that I like to look at. The other thing I like to look at is, what does fine actually mean, right? Does it mean that you are on your second or third marriage because don't express your emotions when you are experiencing hard things? Does it mean that you are happy to communicate and you can have a full range of emotions? So how we define fine can make a difference as well, but there might be some minor ways that trauma is showing up in your life. So some of the signs that we generally see when we're talking about when it might be time for you to work with a qualified mental health professional is if you find yourself emotionally distant or numbing yourself, right? So a lot of times when we look at things like substance use disorder, very often that is a history of trauma. And I have even seen this in children whose, let's say, the mom or dad isn't an alcoholic or doesn't have a substance use disorder, right? But their parents did. Then mom or dad will say like, hey, I don't even drink. Hey, I never did drugs. Why is my child now struggling with substance use? Because those things can actually be passed through the DNA, right? So that predisposition towards having abuse or predisposition towards having that addiction, that is something that can be passed down. But people who are choosing to numb with substance and that can even be food. Sometimes people choose to numb with food. Those types of things can be signs that there might be some trauma showing up. Patterns of conflict and tension in family relationships. If like so-and-so can't be in the same room with so-and-so and those kind of things, that can be a sign of trauma. Difficulty forming or maintaining healthy relationships. If you can start a relationship, but they never seem to go past a year, right? Those kind of things can show up. If you have children who maybe can't seem to keep friends very long, those kind of things can be signs. Repeated family patterns of abuse, neglect, or addiction. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, I'm not going to be anything like my mom. I'm going to do it differently than my dad. And it ends up being that they do it exactly the same way because they're, that root is still there and they haven't addressed the causes of what was going on before. But I've also seen it where people are so fixated on safety, even in non-threatening situations, that they limit or minimize or reduce their, access and exposure to opportunities, right? So very often these unexplained kind of emotional triggers, right? These things that show up, these reactions that seem really disproportionate. So we all are entitled to have a full range of emotions. So everybody can get happy, everybody can be mad, everybody can be sad. But if your response to something is consistently an overreaction or disproportionate or bigger, right? If it's a level 2 problem and you have a level 10 response, that can very often be a sign that maybe there's something else going on. Now, when we're talking about parents, right, trauma influences our parenting style so much because it shapes our beliefs about safety, about trust, and about control. Right. So a parent that has a high history of trauma very often will prioritize safety above all else, which might mean that they're a little bit over controlling because they don't trust people, which would then condition your children in many cases to either resist that control, right? And now you've got this strain in the relationship, or a child who says, okay, well, I want to be safe, so I'll go along with it. And now they've got these signs and symptoms that look like anxiety showing up, okay? We see a lot of hypervigilance, overprotectiveness. I've seen like people-pleasing parents because they're avoiding conflict. They don't want to tell their kids no, so they don't discipline their kids because they don't want their kids to hate them, right? I've often seen this too with parents who are maybe a little bit more emotionally distant, right? So if you're a parent in the room and you're saying, I don't think I do this, but you maybe have a strained relationship with your parent, is it possible that maybe mom or dad is more emotionally distant because of their childhood experiences, right? These patterns of unresolved trauma can create cycles of shame, anger, or neglect in you as a parent. And sometimes it is so hard to see, but sometimes it happens even though we are trying everything in our power to do the right thing. These things just kind of come up because, again, we haven't addressed that root cause. And the other thing I always want to mention, especially when I'm talking about parents, is there is few things in life that is more stressful than being responsible for the life of another human being, right? When you are a parent, when we're talking about that high stress, it affects the parts of our brain responsible for judgment, memory, reasoning, and problem solving. And so if you have a history of trauma, which was created this development of your brain that makes it very hard for you to have good judgment, to have good reasoning, could have good problem solving. And then you are a parent, you're now basically putting yourself under the most stress as possible. And so it's very natural for your trauma responses to come up. So that is why sometimes as a parent, there is nothing that triggers us more than parenting our children, because here we are trying to do the best that we can do for our children. And it just feels like it's walking into one landmine after another, right? Now, Dr. Nadine Burke Harris is the person who I quoted in this slide. She is an expert on those ACEs that I talked to you about. She was very influential in encouraging doctors' offices to start screening for ACEs because they can be an indicator for potential health issues in later life. So if you can kind of identify some of those things, you can put in some early interventions that can be beneficial. She has a book out called The Deepest Well, which is an amazing book. It's great on Audible too. She has a book out that talks about what ACEs are and how it kind of shows up in your life. And she goes into a lot of the science behind what is actually happening into your brain. So this is, if you want more information on this, that's another person that I would definitely recommend. It's important to know that what isn't healed is often repeated, right? Even if you are a great person, it doesn't make you a bad person, right? But what isn't healed is often repeated. So sometimes we have the best of intentions to do the right things, but we haven't done our work to heal. I always say that the greatest gift we can give our children is not a big house, it's not a fancy car, it's not a trip to Disney. The greatest gift that we can actually give our children is to heal any wounds that were created in us by our parents or by our experiences of life, because giving them a healed parent is absolutely the best case scenario. So let's talk about what that might look like for you. And feel free, as those of you that are here live, if you have questions or comments, feel free to raise your hand, put anything in the chat. I will be keeping an eye on both of those as well. So first and foremost, we want to acknowledge the pain that you are experiencing. You got to make peace with your present reality and acknowledge what you're feeling. And this can be really hard, but we cannot heal what we do not acknowledge. This is the first really critical piece of this. It can be difficult, but it's crucial for breaking the cycle. You can't just keep saying, I'm okay, I'm fine, I survived, I'm not in it anymore, it's okay, when those signs are still there. Think about it as if you have an ear infection or something like that. It's not going to get better until you get treatment. You've got to acknowledge that the ear is hurting, then go to the doctor, then do the treatment to actually get those things healed. So over time, things can actually get worse if they're left without that treatment. Very often, the complicated family dynamics that are either learned or passed down, they repeat the damage, right? They repeat that damage over and over again. And many times we just kind of let the shame win, and everybody just kind of tips around on eggshells. They don't have open and honest communication. They don't talk about what's going on. And that is the opposite of what we want to do. We want to acknowledge the pain. So first thing I want you to do, I'm gonna give you a little exercise here, but I'm gonna tell you a story. Now, I know this probably seems crazy because I have a pot roast here on the screen, but let me explain to you why I have this pot roast on the screen. There's an old kind of anecdote that I sometimes share in exercises that explains a little bit about how things get passed down from generation to generation. So imagine that there's a mom and she is getting ready to make dinner for her family. Her child is watching her make this dinner for the family. Child loves pot roast. And she sees mom takes the pot roast out of the package. She cuts the ends off. She puts the pot roast in the pot. Okay. Now she puts that pot roast in, she puts the lid on it. She, puts it in the oven. She lets it cook for hours on end. Now we've got the pot roast in the pot, and the pot roast is cooking. Child comes out. Oh man, this pot roast is so great. She loves this pot roast. That child now grows up. She has a child of her own, and she is making a pot roast. She goes to the store. She buys her pot roast. She brings it back home, just like mom did. She cuts the ends off that pot roast. She puts it in there. She fills the pot up with the carrots and the potatoes and the celery and all the things. She puts it in the oven. She cooks it. Daughter's like, oh, mom, this is great. She loves the pot roast. It's wonderful. That child now grows up. We're on generation number 3. She gets ready to make a pot roast. She goes to the store. She gets the best grass-fed beef she can. She brings it home. She cuts the ends off the pot roast. She puts it in the pot. Her daughter's watching. Her daughter says, Mom, why do you cut the ends off the pot roast? Mom says, I don't know. It's just the way that my mom did it. But she's now curious. She's curious now because she doesn't really know why she cuts the ends off the pot roast. Doesn't make sense. So she calls back to mom. Mom, why did you always cut the ends off of the pot roast? Mom says, well, I don't know. That's the way my mom always did it. So I just did what my mom always did. Now, grandma, mom's mom, right? She's no longer making pot roast, but she's, in well mind. And so she says, let me call grandma and ask her why she did that. I don't know. So she called her. Mom calls her mom, the first generation, and mom says, well, I cut the ends off the pot roast because my pot was too small and it wouldn't fit. So I cut the ends off. That way it would always fit into the pan. Now, 3 generations later, the pan is bigger. There's no need to cut the pot roast up, but it's something that has been passed down in practice. Very often, especially in cultures like, for example, in that book I'd mentioned, post-traumatic slave syndrome, things that we learned and internalized to help our children stay alive throughout slavery and Jim Crow and the civil rights movement and all of these things. A lot of times we pass these things down from generation to generation, and we didn't necessarily ask the questions about why we're doing the things that we're doing. We're just doing it the way that it's already been done. Sometimes those things actually create more harm, and they are not serving the purpose that they originally did. When grandma cut the ends off the pot roast, that made sense. She needed to do that because she had to make sure that the pot roast fit in the pan. But in 2024, we don't need to do that. So some of us have not done kind of that rumbling with some of these practices and patterns that are showing up in our family. Some of us are not, we haven't noticed these things. And because we haven't noticed these things, what's showing up is we're doing these things almost mindlessly that are not benefiting our family. Okay. So I would love for you to just take a minute and think, is there any patterns that might be showing up in your family, things that you have done for years or years, that you're thinking like, maybe this is something that worked at one time, that was necessary at one time, that had a benefit at some time, but it's not serving us anymore, right? I often tell people that I'm a former spanker. I grew up in a family where spanking was a natural and a normal thing, and it was appropriate. It was something that was normalized, but I don't believe in physical discipline of any sort. I understand why my mom thought that that was appropriate. I understand why her mom thought that that was appropriate. It was something that was passed to them, and it was one of the things that it was something, the only way that they knew how to discipline and teach certain behaviors. But in 2024, I know 1,000 different ways to teach behavior, and I don't have to use physical discipline for that. So sometimes something might have had a benefit in the past that doesn't have a benefit now. And if we take a little bit of time to rumble with that, we can identify these patterns that we can work to eliminate so that the hurting and the pain stops with us and it doesn't get passed on. If you can think of anything that like, oh, I think that this is something that my mom did or my grandmother did, and I'm so glad that I don't do now, and you want to share that, you're welcome to unmute if you feel comfortable to do so, or you are also welcome to put that in the chat. The second step that we want to focus on is tapping into our emotions. This is one of those things that, especially when we're talking about a history of trauma, whether that be something that's directly happened to you or something that has happened in your past, from a historical or generational perspective, being able to tap into those emotions is a really important part of moving forward. When you experience trauma, what often happens is our brain and our body and our emotions are all kind of disconnected and they don't collaborate and work well together. And so we want to be able to help with that. Okay. So we want to make an effort to name and appropriately express and then regulate our emotions. So we don't want to let our emotions just kind of run our lives. We don't want to try to avoid our emotions or numb from our emotions, but we want to be able to name them and have appropriate ways to express them and deal with life, even in spite of the emotions that we feel. So paying attention to your emotional triggers, right? So ask yourself, when you find yourself feeling, an intense emotion, like I'm instantaneously angry, or I'm so frustrated, or I feel so overwhelmed, ask yourself, is my response rooted in my present moment? Is this thing that I'm experiencing right now, is this thing that I'm experiencing right now the real cause of this, or has it got something to do with the past? Right? And then the next step is we want to work on breaking the silence, because our emotional experiences very often, remember we talked about, very often those things are rooted in shame. We try to protect ourselves and keep ourselves from being vulnerable and being seen. And so we want to start to have open and honest conversations, right? And this can be with family members or friends who maybe have had a similar experience. And I think this last line is one that I want to make sure everybody really hears. You can share your feelings without blame. I often tell my kids, like, you have no idea how fortunate you are to be in a world where you have access to TikTok and YouTube and the World Wide Web. There's all this access to information that people like me, a 45-year-old, didn't have when I started parenting, right? And I know that my parents, who were older parents, but even parents, who are in their 50s or their 60s, we didn't always have this information, right? So it's not about blaming people for what they've done. It is, however, about acknowledging, like, this is what I have found that works for me, or this is what I am learning that is working for me right now. This is what I'd like to try because I think it will work. Those are the things that you can say so that you're not having to feel like you're blaming your parents or feel like you're trying to create shame in your parents or you're not grateful. It is not at all uncommon that as you start to have these conversations, those things will show up. As a parent, I think it's important for us to also communicate with our children. And when we find ourselves making mistakes and saying, like, ooh, I could have done that a little bit better, or I should have done that a little bit better, our goal is also to make sure that we are not accepting shame, but also are holding accountability. So it might be like, I'm sorry that I snapped at you. That was not okay. I am working on not getting so angry when I feel like I'm being disrespected. But I felt like what you said was disrespectful, and I would like for you to say it differently. We can set boundaries and be clear without trying to force or control or manipulate. Okay. And remember, every single emotion that we have has energy, right? So there are certain emotions that make us feel good and feel high, and there are certain emotions that feel like they're pulling us and dragging us down. Very often, when we're talking about traumatic experiences, we're typically feeling more of these negative emotions, right? And so sometimes when we want to feel better, we're like, I don't know how to get out of this emotion. One of the things you want to do is just try to move up the spectrum. So let's say that you are afraid, right? Maybe you're overwhelmed. It might be a pretty long road to say, I feel empowered, but maybe look for something that will help you to feel hopeful, right? So just try to move up the spectrum. And that is a part of emotional intelligence and emotional regulation. So, having a thing, I was in Syracuse, Indiana yesterday, and I've never been on that lake there. And while I was on the lake, I thought, this is so beautiful and peaceful. And I was at a resort for a speaking engagement, and there were people who obviously live on the lake, and they would take the boat from their home over to the restaurant at the resort, have lunch, and then just take their boat on back home. And I thought, wow, what a peaceful experience, what a peaceful way of life. Well, a lot of us don't necessarily have access to peace like that on a daily basis. So looking for what are the things that help me to feel peaceful, and how can I make more access to that in my daily life? How can I have a little piece of that in my daily life? Those are ways for you to regulate your emotions, which makes it easier for you to parent your child without passing on that pain that maybe you experienced as a part of your childhood. When we talked about those boundaries, here let's go a little bit deeper with that. So the first thing when we're talking about boundaries is clarify what you need to feel safe in relationship. Okay. The goal of a boundary is not to control other people. The goal of the boundary is for you to feel safe. Okay. And it's encouraging. I would even encourage you to do this with your children. Have them decide, like, well, what would make this situation feel a little bit better for you? Or what would make you feel more comfortable in this situation? So clarify what that looks like. When I like to talk about boundaries, one of the things that I say is healthy boundaries are the gifts that we give to other people so that we can be in relationship with them, right? So if I want to have a healthy relationship with my adult children, or I want to have a healthy relationship with my teenagers, I need to create boundaries that work for both of us. So I'm saying what I need in a relationship, and here's what I'm willing to do to be in relationship with you. And this is my expectation. If this expectation isn't met, I'm going to have to make an adjustment. So, for example, let's say that you have a 17-year-old who wants to be able to drive the car on the weekend, right? They want to drive themselves. They've got their license. They're insured. They want to drive themselves. And you say, hey, the boundary that I have to put in place here, because I know that we have this family history of substance use disorder. There can be no drugs and no alcohol in this car, right? That's the boundary that I'm setting in place, right? You get in the car on Sunday morning and realize that the car smells like smoke. So somebody was doing something in that car. You talk to your child and you say, hey, the car smells like somebody's been smoking in here. What's going on? Oh, it wasn't me. It was Johnny, Mom. Oh, that's too bad, because our rule was that there's no smoking, there's no drinking, there's no substances in this car. That means next weekend you can't take the car, right? That's a boundary that allows you to feel safe. That's honoring your responsibility as a parent. That is recognizing that you have the right to say, hey, this is what allows me to feel safe, right? But it's not about being controlling. It's not about being angry. It's not about being defensive. It's about clarifying what you need to feel safe in relationships. And that is appropriate, as opposed to waiting until something bad happens and then exploding, right? It's learning to say no to toxic behaviors, even from family members, while maintaining compassion. A classic one that I see is maybe there's a mom or an older family member, and you have maybe a cultural desire to be respectful, but you're trying to figure out, how can I navigate this thing that they are saying or doing that feels really wrong to me, but I actually want to honor them, but not the behavior, right? Learning how to say no to those behaviors while maintaining compassion is an act of a healthy boundary. And then obviously, we want to make sure as we heal and prevent this from going on, we want to make sure that we give our children an opportunity to develop these healthy boundaries. We want to model the respect and care and open communication in the family. And we want to listen to them when they are expressing themselves, right? And sometimes as a parent, this is hard. It is hard. It is challenging because we're saying like, this child, I would have never done this with my mom, or I would have never said that. But you know that what they're doing is actually what's going to be in their best interest, but it just feels not quite comfortable to you. It just feels a little bit triggering to you. That is modeling and supporting those healthy boundaries. And that is absolutely key in terms of healing. Now, I put this slide in here because there's a lot of almost like a trend of people going no contact. And I'm not here to say whether or not that's going to be best in your situation. I absolutely believe there are times when being, out of contact with someone who is not in their best frame of mind is appropriate. But I really want to be clear that going no contact doesn't heal the wounds, right? If the damage was done, going no contact doesn't change that. You want to be the one who can break that cycle, right? So that it doesn't continue. And going no contact doesn't necessarily do that because the damage might have been done already. So you got to make sure that you are continuing to do your work. So here's a few examples of this. And if you have a specific question or a specific concern that you like me to address, you are welcome to either raise your hand so that you can unmute, or feel free to send me a message in the chat. You can send it directly to me and I'll use yours as an example without using your name. That's fine as well. So instead of shutting down when your child gets angry, you help them name and tame their emotions, right? So he says, "Oh, Johnny, it seems like you are sad right now. Ooh, it seems like you are mad right now, Felicia. What's going on? Tell me a little bit more about what's going on. Where do you feel that in your body, right? Sometimes it helps for me if I'm not in a good mood or if I'm feeling really frustrated. Sometimes going for a walk can help me feel better. Would you like me to try that with you, right? That is a healing way, right? That is a stopping the pain way, right? Another one, instead of yelling at your teenager after they slam the door, like, how dare you slam my door, right? Instead of yelling at them after they slam the door, you take a breath, right? You acknowledge that slamming the door had to be caused by some emotion that they're experiencing. And while I'm going to address this behavior as not appropriate, I want to make sure that I am not triggered or activated before I respond, right? Taking that pause is a really, really great strategy for making sure that you don't accidentally do more harm. You can still address the behavior. You can still say, I recognize that you're really frustrated right now, and that's why you slammed my door. I'm sorry that you're having a hard time, but I'm not going to have damage to my house because we're having a bad day. What can we do about this to be different, right? So you get really clear about that, right? Let's try another one. So instead of allowing that grandparent to criticize your child, right? Let's say grandma thinks that girls should only wear dresses and you have a child who's choosing to wear pants, or maybe grandma is very weight conscious because, that was something that was a negative in her childhood, right? Instead of allowing them to criticize your child, which then causes your child to feel that damage and also might cause that child to look at you as like, oh, you can't keep me safe, right? You have a conversation with grandma before you get to the visit. And you say, Mom, Tiara is working on her weight right now, and I don't want you to have anything to say about her body while we're on the visit. I want her to be able to come and spend time with you. I don't want you looking at what she's eating. I don't want you saying anything about her weight. I don't want you saying anything about her body. Right? Then when grandma starts telling her she should have a little less potatoes, you say, okay, it's time for us to go, kids. We'll, tell grandma bye-bye, and you leave. Right? That's setting a boundary That's respecting your boundary. And that is making sure that you don't allow the damage to continue. Those of us that are more, I'm going to say flight than fight, right? So when we think about traumatic responses, it's always, you hear the term fight or flight. So if you're a person who is like, I don't want to fight, I avoid conflicts, I avoid those types of things. So if that is something that you are, kind of conflict avoidant, or maybe like a people pleaser, this one might be really a challenge for you. But in terms of eliminating the damage, making sure that it doesn't pass on to your child, that is one that will definitely help you. And then last example, but certainly not least, if instead of allowing a family conflict to turn the house into chaos every single weekend, what about trying a new tradition? If that old tradition that you had doesn't work anymore for whatever reason, try a new tradition, right? My family, for years and years and years, we always had Thanksgiving together. And I had four siblings. A couple of my siblings have passed now, but there's three of us left. And so now that all of all of the children have had children, and a lot of the children have had children, there's different extended family members. And so maybe the other family has, they want to have an all family Thanksgiving. So it becomes a little bit more difficult. So we're navigating, like, what can that look like for us? Maybe we should all get together for 4th of July, or maybe we should all get together for Labor Day or something like that, instead of, making Thanksgiving the big issue. And so if setting a new tradition just means like, hey, we want to look at what is the root of this tradition. The root is we want to have time together to relax and enjoy ourselves and collaborate and spend, time building relationships. That's what's important. It doesn't matter whether you're having turkey or hot dogs. What matters is that you are sticking to the heart of what you like to create and pass along, right? And so paying attention to those things can be a really, really good thing for you. So your homework for today, as we get ready to wrap up, your homework is, I want you to think about, what would you like to pass down to your family member? What would you like to pass along? What would you like to share? We don't want to pass on trauma, but what would you like to pass on? And while you're doing that, I'm going to unmute. Is it Tabitha?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Hello.
Do you have a question?
Yes, I do have a quick question.
Absolutely.
I'm going to try to ask this question without making it confusing. But I have a 9-year-old, and he's not quite a teenager yet. He's like in between that age, that different age where he's not a baby, he's not a toddler, and he's not a teenager. But what I noticed about him, and I don't know if he's going through puberty or not, but I do notice that he's very, very emotional. And I'm just going to say this, like with me, I grew up with discipline as like spankings. So that's what I know. That's how I was disciplined, and it allowed me to correct my behavior, and so I kind of find it challenging. Although I have two boys. They don't really get whoopings like or spankings like that, but I noticed with them, for me, it's kind of hard for me to gain that control. With mommy, we're the natural nurturers. So it's like hard for me to not necessarily discipline, but like just show them that authority that I'm in charge. Because sometimes when I talk to them, they feel as if though like, oh well, mommy, I'll be doing it again within 2 seconds or 3 seconds or whatever. So then in my mind, I'm like, well, do I spank them for them to take me serious, or do I do this? And listening to your feedback and your information, I do try to reinforce like communicating and talking to them when they do things that they're not supposed to do, or they're not listening or making good choices. But and that's with my 9-year-old. And of course, he's going through a lot of different changes in life and, just with family. But I find it hard to find the proper way to discipline him.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for sharing. The acronym that I generally recommend when we're trying to change behavior, particularly that we know has an emotional root, okay? I call it the behavior safety nets, and the acronym is NET. What you want to do when you see that emotion that's causing a behavior that you don't want to exhibit, you got to do a name it. You want to use the N as name it. So actually use the emotion that you see, right? So you name what you see. So you're angry right now, right? I can tell that you're frustrated right now. I can tell that you're overwhelmed. I can tell that you're disappointed. You want to get into the habit of using those emotions. You can also print out an emotion list and say, like, which word of these words is what you feel right now, where they can actually point to it, right? And if you don't have access to that, send me an email. I'll have my contact information here at the end, and I will make sure you get access to one of those as well. But you want to get him at 9 years old into the habit of being able to express himself. A lot of times what happens when kids are very emotional and they have these kind of outward behaviors, it's because they don't feel comfortable to verbally express what they're actually feeling. You want to give them empathy, and that usually empathy is almost like a fire extinguisher. It usually will help to de-escalate a challenging behavior, right? So you want to use it almost like a fire extinguisher. It's like, oh, I'm so sorry that you are frustrated right now. I understand how hard that can be. I was frustrated yesterday, or I was frustrated this morning, or I would definitely be frustrated if I was in your same situation. And then you want to use the T, which is teach them what you want them to do. I don't want you to hit the wall. I don't want you to yell at your brother, but here's what you can do. Which one of these would be good for you right now? And you offer them a choice. Remember, discipline isn't about punishing or stopping the behavior. It's about teaching them a replacement behavior to get their actual need met, right? And you can get their need met when you know what that need is. So you want to make sure that you're teaching them how to communicate that. Now, if it's a situation where, you said, you kind of mentioned that there was, some changes going on and things like that. A lot of times kids who are having, symptoms of anxiety and depression, it shows up first in their behavior. So it generally will show up first in outward ways because they don't have the best way to express that. The other thing, and this will be my last tip on this, is make sure that when they are doing the right thing, that you catch them being good. Right? So when he is communicating about his feelings, when he is doing the right thing, you want to make sure, like, oh, thank you so much for doing that. I love the way that you're so kind to your brother. Thank you so much for helping me. I really appreciate that. You want to give them that attention. Occasionally, kids, when they are really struggling with transitions or changes in their lives, their behavior is actually asking you for your attention. And so if you get into this vicious cycle, and it can be a really hard cycle to break, where they misbehave, you react. They misbehave, you react. That is the way that they're getting that need for your attention met. So you want to go above and beyond to catch them doing the right thing. And sometimes that means you have to go out of your way to, like, give them something to do so that you can compliment them. Like, hey, would you, your grandmother was having a hard time. Would you draw her a card today? Because I think I'm going to drop that off on my way to work, so that grandma can then compliment the card. Like, you want to kind of set them up for success. So those are some things that can help, that are ways of, still enforcing some boundaries and having some discipline, but also honoring the emotional need. Does any of that help?
Yes, that's really good. Thank you. And then actually while you were talking, I noticed that a lot of things that he do is for attention,
Okay.
because it was him for 5 years, and now, his
Mhm.
brother, he has a 3-year-old brother. So a lot of that, I have to give more to his brother, and a
Mhm.
lot of times he acts out for my attention. And
Mhm.
I am working more on, like, giving him more time and attention where it's just me and him. But I notice a lot of the root of that attention is, like, I mean, that behavior is because he wants attention.
Right,
But
right.
yes,
And
thank you.
absolutely good, good, good. Any other questions before we go? Any other questions before we go? Okay, well, before we wrap up, I'd love for you, if you have a moment, if you're not on your phone and you have a moment to scan the QR code and give me some feedback on our session today, I would love that. This is our last workshop that is sponsored by Redeemer Presbyterian Church, but we will have different workshops like this. We've been doing these for years. We'll have different workshops from time to time. If you have a topic that you'd like us to cover, or a particular challenge that you are facing and you have interested in that, I would absolutely be more than open to hear about that and to consider that as a topic for our future. So if you're able to scan that QR code and give us some feedback, it is much appreciated. But for our final thoughts, if you are interested in some additional support, so you're saying like some things on you here talked about, I think I probably need a little extra help for that. If you have children, we don't currently accept children at the Well, but here are some places that I personally would recommend based upon referrals that I have either received or feedback that I've gotten. So Indianapolis Counseling and Mentoring. They are also partners with Redeemer Presbyterian Church, which means that if you are a person of color and you don't have access to insurance coverage, they may have access to give you up to 10 to 15 free sessions of counseling, which can be really, really beneficial. And they do work with parents and children, but specifically for children, they definitely have, it's a husband and wife couple, and they do great work over there. Hope Haven, I have referred to for quite a while. Previously, they were our primary referral source for people with Medicaid. We are also getting ready to accept Medicaid now here as well, but they do work specifically with children and teens. One Sensible Solution has both in-person and virtual options, and then Children's Resource Group. All of these are places that we would be, if you're in the Indianapolis area, and they might also do some things outside of the Indianapolis area that you would be able to work on. Now, for adults, so anyone 18 and up, the Well Counseling Group, we do offer several insurance options as well as care credit. And again, we do have that Redeemer Presbyterian Church. Our website is www.thewellcounselinggroup.com. And you can email me directly at admin@thewellcounselinggroup.com. And we generally are able to get people in within 7 days. We have coaches, we have counselors, we have licensed and marriage and family therapists, we have psychologists, we have licensed clinical social workers, and we do have referral relationships with people who can prescribe medication. So psychiatric nurse practitioners and psychiatrists as well. So if you are ever in need of any additional support, we can definitely support you with that. We also have several providers that do provide something called EMDR. So if there is a specific history of trauma for you, EMDR may be a specific type of therapy that is a benefit for you. And again, all you have to do is call our office or check the website, and we'll be happy to offer you those resources that we have. I want to thank you so much for spending your lunch hour with me today. I hope it has been beneficial. I hope you've gotten something out of it. I will have the recording for this up, and we'll make sure that anybody who wants to see the recording, you'll be able to check that out as well. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for investing in yourself and your family. It absolutely has benefit for you, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.